Good morning. Welcome to the U.S. Embassy Kingston Soul Food for Thought. This is a discussion commemorating Black History Month. This discussion is focused on lesser known touchstone moments in the African American experience. This morning, my name is Bernadette Hutchinson. I'm the Cultural Affairs Specialist in the Public Affairs section. And this morning I have with me Mr. Dominic Riley, or Postal Inspector, U.S. Postal Inspection Services, Mr. Dolan Greenwich, Country Attaché, Drug Enforcement Administration, and our special guest, Professor Vereen Shepherd, who is known to many as a social historian and the director of the Institute for Reparations Research at the University of the West Indies, former director of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, and she is a very well-known author in economic history on slavery and the Indian experience in Jamaica. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to also thank our public watching us on our Facebook Live program this morning, and ask that you take notes on interesting things that will be shared this morning. As we said, it's lesser known touchstone moments in the African American experience. And Professor Shepherd will most definitely be sharing not only on the African American experience, but also perhaps dropping in some knowledge for us from the Caribbean experience. So welcome all. I wanted to start with Dominic because Dominic wants to share with us about the roots of the Black History Month celebration and commemoration. Could you tell us a bit more?
Sure, absolutely. So I think in order to start with Black history in the U.S., you have to start with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 with President Lincoln. And he was pushed through that through Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist, who pushed President Lincoln into emancipating the slaves. And with that, there was a start of the Reconstruction in the U.S. And when they did that, there was a upswell of Blacks who were now going into wealth and the business, into medicine and as lawyers, and also in politics. And one of the first politicians was Hiram Revels, who was the first U.S. Senator in Mississippi. And he was also the first president of Alcorn State University, which was an historically Black university and college. And I think that leads up to Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was a historian, and he believed that the Black experience needed to be documented, and he created a Negro History Week in 1924. In 1926, that became a reality, and that soon became Black History Month. And that was because he put it in February. A lot of times people say, why is it in February? It's the shortest month of the year. But he put it in February because he was commemorating the birthday of President Lincoln as well as Frederick Douglass.
Thank you for that, for providing some context for the whole reason we're here. Thank you so very much.
Absolutely.
So, let me ask Dolan to just jump in a bit and tell us what he thinks is a lesser touchstone moment or experience that shaped the Black experience.
Yeah, no, thank you for this opportunity, for giving me this platform to discuss, talk about Black History Month. I'm originally from New York City. I grew up in the Bronx, right across the bridge from Harlem. I spent a great deal of time hanging out in Harlem, discovering historical monuments. It inspired me enough to actually, in my undergraduate degrees in Black history. And one of the areas that I focused on when I was an undergrad was the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance in particular stood out to me because it was the precursor to the Civil Rights Movement. The Harlem Renaissance spans from 1915 up until about the 1930s, just before the Depression had hit. But what's so important to me about the Harlem Renaissance was it was right after, during the time of the Reconstruction and of course Jim Crow. And what the Harlem Renaissance did was it allowed African Americans to migrate from the South to the North looking for opportunities. And Harlem became a cultural hub for artists, activists, and intellectual thinkers. And that time period allowed for African Americans to actually introduce themselves to the world. Um, One of the unfortunate things about slavery is that African Americans was characterized as a result of racism and slavery. And so what the Harlem Renaissance did was to allow African Americans to identify themselves and really introduce themselves to the world through art, activism, as well as intellectual thinkers. Some of my favorite artists that I've studied was Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. As far as intellectual thinkers, you had W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Josephine Baker. Actually, the Marcus Garvey movement was birthed out of that time period of the Harlem Renaissance. And so it, like I said, it led up to the civil rights movement.
Thanks, Dolan. Yes, the Harlem Renaissance was indeed a watershed moment for us as Black people in culture, literature, thought, philosophy, uplifting the race in terms of uplifting yourself. And certainly that was one of the touchstones in the African American. Dr. Shepherd, do you want to touch on, I'm inviting you, sorry, to touch on one of those lesser known touchstone moments before.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. I will mention two, and I'll elaborate a bit on one. I want to first say that the Haitian Revolution, which inspired emancipation struggles all over the Americas, is a touchstone moment. And as some of us know, Haitian soldiers, about 800 of them, fought in the Battle of Georgia. So I think that it is very important for us to understand the role of Haiti and the soldiers who participated in revolutionary movements, freed themselves, but also had a kind of regional freedom logic. And I want to also say that, of course, the War of Independence, it was in 1779 that those soldiers went there. The War of Independence was on in the United States, but of course, afterwards, Haiti wanted all Black people to be free across the region. But I also want to say that the time that Marcus Mosiah Garvey spent in the USA and the impact that Garvey had in advancing the ideology of Black pride and Pan-Africanism in the Caribbean and the USA must be considered an important touchstone moment, because Garvey organized the first important American Black nationalist movement between 1919 and 1926, based in New York, in the city of Harlem. So, though he was born in Jamaica, he left for the USA in 1916 at the invitation of Booker T. Washington. Unfortunately, Booker T. Washington died before he arrived in the United States. But in the US, he was a noted civil rights activist who taught race pride on the speaking tours he undertook in New York City itself and 38 other cities. He believed that white society would never treat Black people equally. Therefore, we would have to unite to demand equality. And while in New York, importantly, he authored the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, which was ratified at the convention of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which he had formed before he went to the United States at Madison Square Garden in 1920. So I think that the work of Marcus Garvey on both sides of the Atlantic must be lauded. And Molefe Kente Asante, professor and chair of the Africology and African American Studies Department at Temple University in Philadelphia, described Marcus Garvey as probably the most significant African political genius that has ever lived, and that he infused his ideas right across the world. So I would say that was an important touchstone moment.
Thank you so very much. And thank you for raising the point of Pan-Africanism. The fact that, yes, what Dominic shared with us about Negro History Week, the start of the Black History Month commemoration. But Pan-Africanism is important in terms of spreading that philosophy, that spirit that is of belief in ourselves as a race. And that has carried through and caused the celebration to grow internationally. So let's talk about it a little bit more. Why do you think, Dolan, these moments are not as celebrated or significantly underreported?
It's hard to say. You're going back to the 1910s, 1920s, the 1930s. Again, the birthstone of African American artistic expression, intellectual thinkers. Though we made some progress, a great deal of progress during the Harlem Renaissance, everyone tends to focus on the civil rights movement. And that's when you had big figures like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, all who were inspired by Garveyism and the Harlem Renaissance time period. As a matter of fact, Malcolm X, he grew up as a Garveyite, him, his mother, and his father. And so I don't think as much progress was made during the times of the Harlem Renaissance, as far as the passing of legislations, Voter Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. It tends to get overlooked or not get as much attention as the civil rights movement. But I think it was an important time period because it gave African Americans a platform to actually have a voice and actually define themselves and you know, to move forward with equal rights and to shape their own story.
Yes, I was just about to ask if any of the other panelists want to expand on the point of why they think such moments are not celebrated or significantly honored.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to answer this question. I personally believe that it was one organization that kept Black history out of the textbooks, and that was the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was a white supremacist organization that was glorifying the Confederacy, and they lobbied to keep any type of history outside of what they wanted in textbooks. So they went around and they made sure that the school district didn't put them in the textbooks, they didn't allow it in the textbooks, they didn't do anything that could be taught so that Black history was celebrated or even thought about. So that was one of the main things that kept all of these real history makers from being glorified and being taught in the schools, which is United Confederacy. That's one of my things that I think that now we are starting to see I guess a correction of that. And now you're seeing the Confederate memorials coming down, the flags are coming down, and that is part of the problem that we had back in the early 1900s.
Professor Shepard, anything you want to?
Well, at the same time, I think that when we talk about the relationships between the USA and the Caribbean, I think too many people focus on migration. Now, migration has been going on for a very long time, so have trading relationships from the time of enslavement and so on. But not enough has been known, about the icons that have brought such awareness of each other and have spread ideologies of freedom and human rights and justice across our two countries, So I think that I agree that we need to popularize and disseminate the ideas, write about them. But if history is not, whether Black history is not a part of the curriculum, then we are trapped in the cycle of ignorance. We have to address writing to write, WRIGHT, writing with a W, to write, RIGHT, those gaps that we have in knowledge, and produce our own knowledge, by the way, because we have to speak about ourselves and destabilize narratives that don't bring honor to our race.
That's a good point to segue into this next question for Professor Shepard, of course. How do you think that as a community we can help to ensure that touchstones like these and others are included in the annals of history and shape the future going forward?
Well, that's the thing. The simple answer is teach history at all levels of the education system. Make it mandatory. In our setting, I don't know about the United States of America, but in our Caribbean, it's not compulsory, and it should be. And we have to ensure that it is history from our perspective, our history that gets told. And we must tell the stories about how we shape each other's history and our collective development. And I want to just mention quickly a story that is a touchstone moment, not known, but how we can answer your question by telling about telling these narratives. As early as 1795, little October, who was renamed Robert Barkley, was 8 years old when he was freed from enslavement on a plantation in Jamaica and sent to Philadelphia. And he made something of himself because he died at age 73. And his descendants, one of whom came to Jamaica in 2018 to spread the story, gave us a fascinating account of how they became anti-slavery activists and human rights activists. So these stories are worth preserving and disseminating. And that's how I think we can bridge the gap and make a difference.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to add as well that what you know, tell what you know, just as you're saying. If within families you do know of stories and of significant moments and you know things that you should be sharing with your children, then go ahead and do that so they can then, as you said, tell the story, because sometimes you don't get the opportunity to speak, but your grandchild may have heard your story and get that opportunity to share that information.
And if these are personal stories, let's share them. And you are quite correct, because sometimes we can start from the family to ask our elders about our story, and people ignore that as a resource.
Definitely, very important. So, Dominic, who are some of the other hidden figures and kingmakers in your perspective who significantly advanced the lives of African Americans?
I can think of two people just off the top of my head. The first one I would say would be Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a investigative journalist who it was her calling to be the documenter of over 4,000 lynchings that were occurring in the U.S. during this really violent time in our country. And I think had it not been for her, we would have not known those stories of those people that were going through. She was also a co-founder of the NAACP. So she fought for justice for a long time. So I would say Ida B. Wells for sure. And being a son of Mississippi, I learned of Ida B. Wells young because she was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. But I think that she is someone who not a lot of people know about. She was also a very instrumental person in the women's suffrage. So she was one of the main persons to push for women's rights to vote. The other person I would say would be Bayard Rustin. A lot of people don't know Bayard Rustin, but Bayard Rustin was one of the advisors to Dr. Martin Luther King. He was the one that was pushing Dr. Martin Luther King to use the nonviolent approach. He was also one of the organizers of the March on Washington in 1963. So I would say Bayard Rustin, although he's not very well known, he was a kingmaker in the fact that he was one of Martin Luther King's primary advisors, along with A. Rudolph.
Thank you very much. And those are two very, very significant figures. We do know that because, well, it has been shared that maybe because of his orientation. He was a black gay man.
He was
at a time when those rights were necessarily being pushed to the forefront.
Absolutely.
It was harder for them to put him up front as one of their key persons, but he was so very instrumental in terms of what he did to make sure the movement was organized, was presented in a particular way, and a debt of gratitude as well.
Absolutely.
Dolan and Professor Shepherd, do you think, could you share with us, any hidden figures in your mind and kingmakers who significantly advance the lives of African Americans or Black people globally?
Well, if I may, I want to introduce two names. They are connected. because Eric Waldron was a literary figure in the Harlem Renaissance, and I don't think enough people know about him. And I have to confess, until I started to do the biography of his daughter, Lucille Mathurin Mayer, who helped us to know so much about gender and history. I didn't know much about him either, but he was an important figure, and he enriched the lives of the Caribbean people as well as people in Harlem and other parts of the United States. And his daughter, Lucille Mathurin Mayer, became a diplomat at the UN, and she, I think, gave lectures and speeches in the United States. And many historians in the United States, there's universities who are writing and teaching about women's history, benefited from her 1974 work. And so I think that we have to, as we are on the cusp of Women's History Month, we have to also think about the women, Amy Ashwood Garvey, who also helped to inspire Pan-Africanism and Black pride in our two countries.
Thank you. Dolan, do you want to chime in here or?
I will go back to Zora Neale Hurston. I think she, again, one of the more unrecognized figures for a period of time. She wrote several great books. She was an anthropologist, a folklorist. She wrote articles in several newspapers. She wound up passing away broke in an unmarked grave. And it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that her works and her contribution to the African American experience was rediscovered, mainly by Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and some of the more contemporary writers that we know of today. But I think her contribution was quite large. She traveled to Haiti, where she wrote her book Voodoo and a number of great works, like I said, that didn't get the recognition that it deserved back then. And I don't think people recognize her as much as she should be for her contribution to telling our story and her contribution to African American artistry and literature.
Thank you for those key, for sharing those key persons in your minds that were actually hidden figures to a certain extent and kingmakers. So Dolan, building on your last point, is there the potential for modern day African American rebirth, similar to the Harlem Renaissance?
Absolutely. And I think the pattern is the same, that, you know, our artists and athletes have the biggest voice in promoting change and actually motivating people, and I guess bringing attention to civil rights. And so throughout African American history, again, artists and athletes have had a bigger platform and actually bringing awareness to some of the issues that we face as a people and bringing about change.
Thank you for your response. Dominic, do you see artists and athletes currently doing what Dolan is posing that they have the ability to do? Have you seen evidence of that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see LeBron James, for instance, he's building schools, and Colin Kaepernick standing up. And it goes back to that old, from the old example of your Jim Browns and your Muhammad Ali's and people like that. And I think that people now have gotten to a point where they are, the younger generation is now pushing for, I want rights and I want my rights now. So I think that this renaissance is beginning, it's already begun.
Thank you, Dominic. Professor Shepherd, you know, history is a living thing. History is happening now. They always think that it's just what happened 50 years ago, 300 years ago, but history unfolds every day. What do you think about a sort of rebirth, similar to the Harlem Renaissance, similar to a period where a Marcus Garvey could rise and influence and and affect the lives of so many. Is that possible here in the Caribbean?
Of course, and I think we're seeing that happening in the Caribbean. And not only because there has been a globalization of the Black Lives Matter campaign and the movement, but also because of how we try to use memory. There is something about memory that helps us to memorialize and to honor and to keep the history on the visual landscape. So I think that is happening. I've seen young people mobilizing, especially for around the reparatory justice movement, which again unites our two countries. That has, when you teach about the historic wrongs and they see the modern day application of the legacy of colonialism, then I think that makes them want to know more and want to get involved.
Thank you. So this is our last question. How can people of African descent throughout the Western Hemisphere harness our collective history to advance the lives of future generations to include uprooting deeply held negative stereotypes? So moving forward, how do we change the thinking that holds on to negative stereotypes and advances forward?
Do you want me? Well, let me jump in there.
I threw it all to the panel.
Okay, let me jump in then. So I start by saying that the one thing that has united our people in the USA and Jamaica and the West Caribbean is the insistence on human rights and social justice and the struggle against discrimination, especially anti-Black racism, rooted in the experience of chattel enslavement, Jim Crow in your case, and racial apartheid. So if we research and disseminate that history and our collective response to that history from grassroots to governments, then I think we will eventually ensure that future generations understand the evils of stereotypes and discrimination and help to root out such evils in our respective countries. We have to explain the harmful impact of ranking or hierarchizing which scarred our nations on whatever grounds: class, race, skin color, residential location, school we attend, gender, sexuality, and I could go on. And that's why I want to bring in here the fact that 182 states, including the USA and Jamaica, have signed on to the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and all other forms of discrimination. And Article 1 binds us. It defines racial discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, the economic, social, the cultural, or any other field of public life. So we have to disseminate the idea that there are rights enshrined in international conventions to which our countries should be held accountable. And if we popularize that, then I think that we teach the future generation that ideologies and stereotypes are wrong. We must get rid of them, and we must work towards really one humanity. And that's why we also recently adopted General Recommendation 36 on racial profiling, by public officials, by law enforcement officials. And we are at the UN kind of disseminating information on that, so that we join other human rights activists in saying, let's get rid of these stereotypes and build a united world.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Shepard. It is telling that we are still reaching out to these international organizations to push these rights and to ensure what we think are basic and inalienable sort of human rights, but we have to be pushing it at that level. So thank you for your work on reparations and all that you're doing at that level.
And I should just add that one of your women activists, Gay McDougall, my colleague on the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and really, really working. We're working collectively to ensure the respect for these rights and the use of international conventions and instruments and protocols.
Thank you. My fellow panelists, do you have any closing remarks?
Sure. I think that you are starting to see a resurgence of community. You're starting to see people read more and study history more. And I see that a lot of people are starting to go back into wealth generation, to try to build wealth for their families and their grandchildren. And I think that with all of that and this younger generation demanding rights and their rights now, I think you're going to start to see a better world.
We're looking forward to it. Dolan, any closing remarks?
Yeah. Education and exposure. People hate what they fear, and they fear what they don't understand. Through education and exposure, you realize that people are people. It's hard to hate someone when you get to know them and you realize that you have more in common than you don't. And so, with technology, social media, the world becoming smaller, I have great hope in the next generation. Again, the exposure to each other's culture, getting to know and understand one another. Progress is happening. It's happening slow, but it's happening. Again, education and exposure.
Thanks, Dolan. Any other closing remarks, Professor Shakur?
Well, I agree actually about education. And Article 5 of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination outlines these social and economic rights. And one of them is education. And so we are challenged in this time of COVID-19, the pandemic, in ensuring that right. But I still say we have to work very hard so that our children, no child is left behind, because that will hamper the future that we are all hoping that they will have. Empower themselves economically, learn a skill, the kind of education that will get them admitted to tertiary institutions and improve themselves, because we all know that one route out of poverty is education for people of African descent, affected and scarred by the impact of colonialism. And we share that. And so I would just endorse the need for education.
Thank you so very much. So in conclusion, just to wrap up, I just wanted to point out some of the main things that were discussed. And the key thing that I think I am taking away is that we need to start telling our stories and telling our truths. So from the lessons that we are learning from Zora Neale Hurston to Ida B. Wells, from Carter G. Woodson to the contributions of Marcus Garvey and Colin Kaepernick, as well as, looking at the experience of the Haitian Revolution and the movement towards reparations currently, as well as understanding that Black Lives Matter as a movement it's basically underscoring the fact of civil rights. And civil rights are, in essence, human rights, basic human rights. So we want to focus in terms of moving forward on removing negative stereotypes and continue to do this by telling simple truths, our story, our history. Thank you very much to the panel for joining us. Thank you very much, Professor Shepard, for stepping away from your very busy schedule. I know that Dominic and Dolan are also busy, but we are really appreciative that a historian of your caliber was able to join us and make the conversation that much richer. Thank you to our audience out there, the public, for listening in and appreciating the information that was shared. This concludes our Black History Month series of conversations, but we do invite you to join us in March for Women's History Month and the programs that will come your way based on that theme. Thank you again.